My name is Faith Lawson, and I am 34 years old. Most people in the city of Portland know my mother, Elena Lawson, as the patron saint of lost causes, the woman who sits on the boards of 3 major nonprofits and wears her philanthropy like a suit of armor forged in gold and good intentions. But as I stood in the wings of the grand ballroom at the Benson Hotel, watching her adjust the collar of her $450 silk Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress, I saw the truth underneath the polished mahogany and the scent of Joe Malone lime basil and mandarin perfume. Her whisper was a razor blade against my skin, cold and lethal, as she leaned in close enough for only me to hear. "You were a mistake I had to erase to survive," she hissed, her eyes tracking the movements of the photographers in the front row. "Don't ruin this for me, Faith." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life, the woman who raised me felt like a complete stranger. To the world, I am a palliative care nurse at Riverside Hospice. I spend my life in the quiet, sterile corridors of the 3rd floor, pulling 12-hour shifts that leave my back aching and my soul weary. I earn $42.50 an hour, a wage that barely covers the rent on my 600-square-foot apartment on the edge of the Pearl District and the mounting repairs on my aging 2014 silver Honda Civic with the rattling exhaust manifold. My life is measured in the rhythmic hum of oxygen concentrators and the soft scratching of my pen against clinical charts as I watch the digital clock on the nurses' station hit 3:14 a.m. I have spent a decade holding the hands of strangers as they take their final breaths, offering a comfort I never received myself. For 32 years, I lived under the weight of a story my mother had carefully crafted for me like a funeral shroud. She told me my father was a ghost, a heroin addict who had traded my very crib for a fix and disappeared into the grimy underbelly of Seattle before I could even crawl. She made me feel like I was the byproduct of a tragedy, a burden she had heroically carried alone while building her real estate empire. But she was lying. Every word was a calculated brick in a wall, built to hide a truth so ugly it would have scorched her reputation to ash. Before I lay out the evidence, the bank statements from 1994 and the signed non-disclosure agreements that dismantled 3 decades of deception, I need you to understand the environment that forged me. Growing up in the Lawson household was like living in a museum where you weren't allowed to touch the exhibits. Our house in the West Hills was a sprawling 5-bedroom mid-century modern masterpiece with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city lights. But inside, it was as cold as a morgue. My mother, Elena, was the executive vice president of Sterling and Associates, a commercial development firm. She dealt in millions of dollars, navigating the shark-infested waters of Portland's real estate market, while I was tucked away with a series of revolving nannies. I remember the sound of her heels, the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of Prada pumps on the white oak floors, signaling that I needed to disappear into my room. I was the inconvenient reminder of a past she wanted to bury. While other children had bedtime stories, I had lectures on the cost of my existence. I was told exactly how much my private school tuition cost at Catlin Gable, exactly how much she spent on my orthodontics, and how every cent was a sacrifice she made because my father had left us with nothing. She painted a picture of a man named Marcus who was a monster, a shadow in a leather jacket who had stolen her youth and her savings. I grew up feeling a profound sense of debt. I felt like I had to earn my place in the world because my very DNA was tainted by the man who had supposedly abandoned me. This guilt is what drove me into nursing. I wanted to balance the scales. If my father had taken life away through his addiction, I would spend mine preserving the dignity of those leaving it. I worked through nursing school, taking out $60,000 in federal student loans because my mother insisted that paying for my college would jeopardize her retirement fund, even as she purchased a new black 2022 Porsche Cayenne GTS with a sticker price of over $130,000. The turning point came 3 weeks ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while I was cleaning out the attic of my mother's summer house in Cannon Beach. She had asked me to go down there to box up some old files, a task she felt was beneath her but perfect for her dutiful nurse daughter. The air in the attic was thick with the smell of salt air and old paper. I was moving a stack of dusty banker's boxes when I found a small, locked mahogany chest tucked behind a cedar wardrobe. The key was taped to the underside of a nearby drawer. Inside, I didn't find drug paraphernalia or evidence of a criminal past. I found a meticulously organized file of monthly wire transfers. Starting in September of 1990, the month I was born, and continuing until my 18th birthday, there were payments of $5,000 every single month. They didn't come from a ghost or an addict. They came from a trust fund linked to Julian Vane, the billionaire founder of Vane Global Logistics, the man who had been my mother's primary business mentor and, as it turned out, the man whose name was on the board of the very hospital where I worked. My father wasn't a heroin addict. He was the most powerful man in the Pacific Northwest, a man who had been married for 40 years to a prominent socialite. My mother hadn't been a struggling single parent. She had been a well-paid secret. She had taken $3,000 of that money every month for her own investments, funneling it into the down payments for the apartment complexes that made her wealthy, while telling me we were one missed paycheck away from the street. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest, more jarring than any trauma call I'd ever handled at the hospice. I sat on the dusty attic floor, surrounded by proof that my entire identity was a fabrication. She had sold my father's reputation to buy her own respectability, and she had sold mine to keep me subservient. I spent my 20s living in poverty, eating ramen and driving cars with bald tires, while she sat on millions of dollars that had been intended for my upbringing. She had even forged a letter from Marcus, the fictional addict, telling me not to look for him because he didn't love me. I found the draft of that letter in her own handwriting, tucked inside a 1995 ledger. This brings me back to the Benson Hotel ballroom. The occasion was the Hope and Healing Gala, where my mother was being honored for her work with underprivileged youth. The irony was so thick it felt like I was choking on it. The room was filled with the scent of $500 floral arrangements, lilies and white roses that smelled like a funeral. My mother stood there in her DVF dress, the silk shimmering under the crystal chandeliers, looking every bit the savior. When she saw me standing in the wings, not in a gown but in my wrinkled blue scrubs because I had just come from an 18-hour shift where I'd lost 2 patients in one night, her face contorted in a mask of polite fury. She walked over to me, pretending to give me a motherly embrace for the cameras, but as her arms went around me, she squeezed my biceps with a strength that left marks. That was when she whispered those words. "You were a mistake I had to erase to survive. Don't ruin this for me." I felt the weight of the envelope in my pocket, the one containing the photocopies of the wire transfers and the forged letter. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm that echoed the monitors in the hospice. I looked at the crowd of wealthy donors, the people who whispered about how wonderful Elena Lawson was for overcoming such a tragic past with her daughter's father. They didn't know that the tragedy was sitting right in front of them, wearing silk and diamonds. I thought about the man I had spent 32 years hating, the man I thought had traded my crib for drugs. Marcus didn't exist. He was a ghost created by a woman who valued her image more than her child's sanity. And Julian Vane, my actual father, was sitting at table 4, 3 rows back, clinking glasses with the governor. He looked at me for a brief second, his blue eyes identical to mine, and then looked away as if I were just a part of the catering staff. He knew. He had paid for my silence for 18 years, and my mother had pocketed the change. The injustice of it felt like a cold fire in my veins. I had spent my life caring for the dying, listening to their final regrets, and the most common one was always the things left unsaid. I realized then that I wouldn't be like them. I wouldn't die with this secret stuck in my throat like a shard of glass. My mother pulled away, plastering a radiant smile on her face as the master of ceremonies called her name. She began to walk toward the stage, her stride confident, the embodiment of grace and triumph. I stood there in the shadows, my hand trembling as I reached for the microphone on the podium in the wings, the one meant for the tech crew. I wasn't just a palliative care nurse anymore. I wasn't the mistake she had erased. I was the witness to her crimes, and the clock had just hit the hour of reckoning. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, charged with the static of an impending storm. I could smell the expensive wine, the Wagyu beef being served at $80 a plate, and the metallic tang of my own fear. But underneath the fear was a resolve as hard as the granite counters in my mother's kitchen. She had spent 30 years writing my story. Now I was taking the pen back. I stepped out from the curtain, the bright stage lights blinding me for a moment, and I didn't look at the audience. I looked directly at the woman in the silk dress, the woman who had traded her daughter's soul for a Saint of the Year award, and I felt the truth beginning to pour out of me, unstoppable and cold. Family isn't the blood that flows in your veins. It's the truth you're willing to live with. And my mother's truth was a debt that had finally come due. The financial gap that existed between my mother and me was not a mere distance. It was a vast, echoing canyon carved by decades of her calculated greed and my enforced poverty. My mother, Connie, lived a life that was a meticulously curated gallery of suburban success, anchored by her $680,000 colonial home in the pristine heights of the West Hills. Every inch of that property screamed of a stability she claimed we never had when I was a child. The two-car garage, always kept at a climate-controlled 68 degrees, housed her gleaming silver 2023 Lexus RX 350, a vehicle that smelled eternally of expensive leather, and the high-end car detailer she paid $150 to visit every 2 weeks. Her world was one of polished surfaces and performative gratitude, decorated with those ubiquitous wood plank signs that commanded everyone to stay blessed or find joy in the journey, while she spent $120 every 6 weeks at Salon de Paris to maintain the perfect ash blonde highlights that never showed a single strand of gray. She moved through the aisles of the local upscale grocery store with the grace of someone who never had to check the price of organic dragon fruit or wonder if her debit card would be declined at the register. In stark and painful contrast, my existence was a grueling exercise in survival and suppressed resentment. I lived in a 610-square-foot apartment on the bruised edge of the city, where the walls were so thin I could hear my neighbor's television through the drywall and the persistent, rhythmic dripping of a leaky faucet I couldn't afford to fix because my landlord was a ghost who only appeared when the rent was due. My monthly rent was $1,400, a staggering sum that consumed exactly 40% of my take-home pay from the hospice, leaving me to navigate the remaining 60% between student loan payments, a soaring utility bill that averaged $185 in the winter, and the rising cost of gasoline for my battered silver Honda. While my mother was sipping mimosas at brunch with her suburban church circle, I was calculating whether I could afford the good laundry detergent or if I had to settle for the generic brand that left my scrubs smelling like industrial chemicals. I was the miracle daughter in her narrative, the living proof of her martyrdom, a human prop she trotted out to gain social capital and sympathy from women who wore pearls and talked about the power of prayer over catered salads. She wore a $2,400 David Yurman cable-buckled bracelet on her wrist, the gold and diamonds catching the light every time she reached out to pat my hand in public and tell someone how hard I worked as a nurse. It was a heavy, expensive weight that symbolized the wealth she had siphoned away from my own future. Yet I was the one expected to be grateful for her guidance. My own wrist bore a different kind of weight, a $12 plastic lanyard with a cracked plastic casing that held my hospital identification badge. That badge, blue and white with a faded photo of me looking exhausted during my first year of residency, was the key to a world of shadows and final breaths, and it was the very thing a dying man would eventually use to shatter the glass house my mother had built around us. I spent my days in the muted, beige hallways of Riverside Hospice, where the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy, floral sweetness of lilies left by grieving relatives. I was a palliative care nurse, a role that required me to be a steady anchor for people drifting into the unknown. Yet my own life felt like it was anchored to a lie that was slowly dragging me under. My mother's church friends saw her as a saint who had raised me alone against impossible odds, a woman who had sacrificed her youth to ensure I had a roof over my head after my father supposedly abandoned us. They would gather in her living room, sitting on her $3,000 restoration hardware sofa, and murmur about how inspiring she was. Connie would sigh, her hand going to her throat where a delicate gold cross rested, and she would tell them about the dark days when she didn't know how she would pay for my shoes, all while neglecting to mention the $5,000 monthly deposits hitting her secret account from a man she had promised to never speak of again. She had commodified her struggle, turning a comfortable, subsidized lifestyle into a tragic epic where she was the lone survivor. I was just the supporting character, the girl who was told she was lucky to have a mother who stayed, the girl who was conditioned to believe that every meal was a gift and every pair of jeans was a luxury we could barely afford. The hypocrisy of our lives was a constant, low-grade fever that I carried with me into every patient's room. I would stand in a room that cost $800 a day, adjusting a morphine drip for a man who had spent 40 years building a legacy, and I would think about my mother's silver Lexus and the way she complained about the price of a latte if she thought I was getting too comfortable. She kept me in a state of perpetual financial anxiety, a tactic designed to ensure I would never feel secure enough to question her or move far enough away to escape her influence. She wanted me close, not because she loved me, but because she needed an audience for her performance. If I succeeded too much, her story of struggle would lose its edge. If I failed too much, she would look like a poor mother. So she kept me exactly where I was, hovering just above the poverty line, exhausted and indebted, while she flourished in the garden of my father's silence. One particular Tuesday, the contrast was more than I could handle. I had just finished a double shift, my eyes burning from the fluorescent lights and the weight of a particularly difficult passing of a young father in room 302. I stopped by my mother's house because she had insisted I pick up a box of old sweaters she was donating to the church, a task she could have easily done herself. As I walked up the manicured stone path, I saw her through the window. She was laughing, holding a glass of chilled Sauvignon Blanc, her highlighted hair perfectly coiffed, looking like a woman who didn't have a single care in the world. When I entered, the smell of expensive candles, something like sandalwood and vanilla that probably cost $60 at a boutique, filled my nose, clashing with the lingering scent of hospital bleach that seemed to be etched into my skin. She looked at my wrinkled scrubs and my tired face with a mixture of pity and disdain, the kind of look you give a stray dog you've decided to feed out of a sense of obligation. "Faith, honey, you look absolutely haggard," she said, her David Yurman bracelet clinking against the marble countertop as she set her glass down. "You really should take better care of yourself. People will start to think I don't help you." The cruelty of that statement, delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes, was a cold splash of water. She didn't help me because she had convinced me for years that there was no money to help with, that she was just as broke as I was, despite the evidence of her surroundings. She lived in a colonial mansion while I lived in a box with thin walls, yet she had the audacity to worry about how my exhaustion reflected on her reputation. She was a master of the narrative, a woman who could weave gold out of the lead of her own deceptions. I took the box of sweaters, the weight of them feeling like a heavy burden I was forced to carry for her vanity, and I left without saying a word, the sound of her silver Lexus pulling out of the driveway 10 minutes later to go to a dinner party ringing in my ears like a taunt. The sheer scale of her deception was almost impressive, if it wasn't so destructive. She had managed to convince a whole community of her virtue while living on the proceeds of a billionaire's guilt. She wore those $120 highlights like a crown, a symbol of her status as a woman of means who had earned every penny through grit and determination. Meanwhile, I was counting quarters for the laundromat because my apartment building's machines only took physical coins and I didn't have the time to go to the bank. I was the miracle daughter, the one who survived the addiction and the abandonment, a living testimony to Connie's strength. But the truth was that I hadn't survived my father's addiction because it didn't exist. I was surviving my mother's avarice. I was surviving the fact that she had looked at her own child and seen a paycheck, a way to secure a life of luxury at the expense of my truth. I remember looking at that David Yurman bracelet, the way the light danced off the twisted silver and gold, and realized it wasn't just jewelry, it was a handcuff. It was the price of her silence, the physical manifestation of the lie she had told me every day of my life. She had traded my father's name for a silver Lexus and a colonial home with a 2-car garage. She had traded my sense of belonging for a curated life of blessed signs and expensive highlights. And she expected me to play my part, to be the tired, struggling nurse who made her look like a saint. But she had forgotten one thing about my job. As a hospice nurse, I am trained to look for the truth in the final moments. I am trained to see past the polished surfaces and the expensive perfume to the reality of what lies beneath. And as I held that $12 plastic lanyard, the one that would soon connect me to the man who actually gave me life, I realized that the canyon between us was about to be filled with the one thing my mother couldn't afford: the truth. The glass walls of her colonial mansion were about to shatter, and I wouldn't be there to catch the pieces. I would be standing in the ruins, finally breathing air that wasn't scented with her lies, finally free from the weight of being her miracle. Family isn't the house you live in or the car you drive. It's the honesty you bring to the table. And at my mother's table, the only thing being served was a carefully plated deception that had finally turned sour. The moment the foundation of my life began to dissolve into a slurry of lies and industrial bleach occurred in room 12B at precisely 2:22 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt as heavy and gray as a tombstone. Outside the reinforced glass windows of Riverside Hospice, a relentless Oregon rain was drumming against the building, a rhythmic and cold sound that seemed to sync with the erratic beeping of the bedside monitors. The air in the unit was a thick, suffocating cocktail of smells that I had become accustomed to over my years as a palliative care nurse. The sharp, nasal sting of $4 a gallon generic hand sanitizer and the cloying, chemical scent of medical-grade disinfectant used to scrub the linoleum floors until they shone like mirrors. My patient, a man named Robert Lawson, was 55 years old, but the stage 4 pancreatic cancer eating through his abdomen had aged him by decades in a matter of months. He was skeletal now, a ghost of a man whose weight had plummeted to a terrifying 134 pounds, leaving his skin draped over his bones like translucent parchment. He had spent his life as a master carpenter, building custom mahogany staircases and white oak cabinetry for the wealthy families in the West Hills, and even now, as his life was flickering out, his hands remained the strongest thing about him. I had leaned over his bed to adjust the high-flow nasal cannula that was providing him with a desperate, hissing stream of oxygen when it happened. His right hand, calloused and scarred from 40 years of handling saws and chisels, shot out from beneath the thin hospital blanket and gripped my blue and white identification badge with a strength that defied his physical state. The cheap $12 plastic casing of the badge crunched audibly in his grasp, the sound echoing in the silent room like a snapping bone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I looked into his eyes, expecting to see the cloudy, distant glaze of a high-dose morphine infusion or the agitated confusion of terminal delirium. Instead, his gaze was piercing, a sharp and lucid blue that burned with a desperate final clarity that sent a shiver of pure ice down my spine. His voice was a ragged, wet wheeze that sounded like dry leaves scraping against pavement, but the words were as clear as a bell in the stillness of the night. "Connie Mitchell told me you died in a 1994 car crash in Kentucky," he whispered, his grip tightening until the plastic of my lanyard began to bite into the back of my neck. I stood there, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was saying, while the digital clock on the wall pulsed with a steady red light. He didn't let go, his knuckles white against the blue fabric of my scrubs as he pulled me closer to the scent of his fading life. He began to talk, the words spilling out in a feverish, desperate torrent as if he were trying to empty his soul before the clock hit the next hour. He told me that for 30 years he had been haunted by the memory of a 3-year-old girl with my exact eyes and a small crescent-shaped scar on her left temple from a fall in a backyard garden he had built with his own hands. He had spent $84,200 on private investigators over 3 decades, pouring every cent of his savings into a search for a ghost. He showed me the receipts of his life's work, not in money, but in the thick, weathered manila folder sitting on his bedside table, filled with reports from agencies in Louisville and Nashville, and finally Portland. My mother, the woman I knew as Connie, the saint of the suburban church, had not been abandoned by a heroin-addicted ghost named Marcus. She had been the architect of a kidnapping so complete it had erased my very existence from the public record. She had faked my death in 1994 using a tragic but unrelated multi-car pileup on Interstate 65 to provide the cover she needed to vanish. She had stolen me from this man, this carpenter who had loved us, and she had moved across the country to start a clean life where no one knew her name or her past. She had reinvented herself as the tragic widow, the martyr mother, all to catch the eye of a wealthy car dealership owner who could provide the colonial home and the silver Lexus she believed she deserved. My father was not a monster. He was the man currently dying in room 12B, a man who had worked double shifts and taken out second mortgages just to fund a search for a daughter he was told was buried in a Kentucky cemetery. The betrayal was so immense, so chemically pure in its cruelty, that I felt the room begin to tilt on its axis. Every blessed sign in her house, every $120 highlight in her hair, and every gold link on her David Yurman bracelet had been paid for with the currency of this man's suffering and my own stolen identity. Robert Lawson's chest heaved as he fought for air, his eyes never leaving mine, searching for the child he had lost in the face of the woman I had become. He told me about the nursery he had built for me, using aromatic cedar for the closet and hand-carving a mobile of wooden birds that hung over a crib he had spent 6 months perfecting. He described the smell of the sawdust on his clothes when he would come home to find Connie already packing her bags, though he hadn't realized then that she was packing for a permanent disappearance. She had waited for a day when he was on a job site 2 towns over, and by the time he returned, the house was empty. The bank accounts were drained of their modest $4,000, and his wife and daughter had vanished into the humid Kentucky afternoon. 2 weeks later, he received a phone call from a woman claiming to be a hospital administrator, telling him that a car matching Connie's description had gone over an embankment and that there were no survivors. There were no bodies to identify, she had said, citing a fire that had consumed the wreckage, a lie so bold it could only have been crafted by someone with a sociopathic disregard for human life. As I listened, the details of my own childhood began to rewrite themselves in real time. The reason we never had family photos from before I was 4, the reason my mother would become hysterical if I ever asked about my birth certificate, which she claimed had been lost in a basement flood, and the reason she had insisted on changing my name from Faith to something she felt sounded more prestigious before settling back on Faith when she realized the irony would help her church narrative. She had kidnapped me and then had the audacity to charge me for the cost of my own upbringing, making me feel like a financial burden for 30 years while she sat on the security of her new husband's wealth. She had stolen a father from a daughter and a daughter from a father, and she had done it simply because a carpenter wasn't wealthy enough to satisfy her appetite for a colonial lifestyle. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made the air in the room feel like it was being sucked out by a vacuum. I looked at Robert's hands, the hands of a builder, now trembling and weak as they let go of my badge. He reached for the manila folder and pushed it toward me with a shaking finger. Inside were the reports, the grainy photographs of my mother taken by investigators at various grocery stores over the years, and finally, a copy of the private investigator's final report dated only 2 months ago, which had finally tracked her to the silver Lexus and the colonial home in the West Hills. He had found us, but the cancer had found him first, and he had spent his final days praying that the nurse assigned to his room would be the one person he needed to see before he closed his eyes for the last time. He wasn't there for palliative care. He was there for a reunion he had paid for with his life's blood. I looked at the man who was my real father, seeing the blue of my own eyes reflected in his tear-filled gaze, and I felt a tectonic shift in my soul. The woman I had called mother was a thief of the highest order, a woman who had traded a man's heart for a 2-car garage and a curated social standing. The sheer technical precision of her lie was what haunted me the most in that quiet, sterile room. She had navigated the pre-digital era with the cunning of a predator, moving between states and changing social security numbers with a fluidity that suggested she had planned the escape long before it happened. She had raised me in a house built on a foundation of kidnapping and fraud, teaching me to be humble and grateful for her sacrifices while she wore the spoils of her crime on her wrist. I thought about the many nights I had spent crying over my supposed father's addiction, the shame I felt at being the daughter of a man who would trade a crib for a fix, and I realized that my mother had purposefully planted that image in my mind to ensure I would never go looking for him. She had turned a hard-working craftsman into a drug-addicted monster to protect her own comfort, a psychological manipulation so profound it made my skin crawl with a sudden, violent revulsion. I reached out and took Robert's hand, his skin feeling like cold marble against mine. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just let the sound of the rain and the monitors fill the space between us. I was no longer the nurse, and he was no longer the patient. We were two victims of the same elegant, silk-draped crime. I thought about Connie, probably asleep in her high thread count sheets in the colonial house, her silver Lexus parked safely in the garage, her David Yurman bracelet resting on a velvet tray on her nightstand. She had no idea that the past she had faked a death to escape was currently breathing its last breaths in room 12B, or that her miracle daughter had just become her most dangerous witness. The 2:22 a.m. time on the clock seemed to freeze, a singular moment of realization that would define the rest of my life. My mother had told me that I was a mistake she had to erase to survive, but the truth was that she was the mistake, a moral vacuum that had sucked the life out of everyone around her to fuel her own vanity. As I sat there holding my father's hand, I felt a cold, hard resolve settling in my chest, a feeling more permanent than the grief and more powerful than the fear. She wanted me to keep her secret so she could win her Saint of the Year award, but she had forgotten that I deal with the truth of death every single day. I know what a person's life is worth when the silk dresses and the silver cars are stripped away, and I knew exactly what hers was worth now. Nothing. I looked at the skeletal man in the bed, the carpenter who had spent $84,000 to find a daughter who was standing right in front of him, and I made a silent vow. I would not let him die as a ghost. I would not let her lie be the final word on his life or mine. The truth is a debt that doesn't care about the statute of limitations, and my mother's account was finally, irrevocably overdrawn. Family isn't the person who raises you in a house built on lies. It's the person who spends their last dollar and their last breath just to find out if you're still alive. And for the first time in 34 years, I finally knew who my family was. I sat in the driver's seat of my 2017 silver Honda Civic in the farthest corner of the Riverside Hospice parking lot at 7:15 a.m., the engine ticking as it cooled in the damp morning air. Above me, the gray Ohio sky was a flat, unyielding expanse of slate that reflected off my windshield, making the world outside look like an old, desaturated photograph. My hands were still shaking slightly from the physical touch of the man who was my father, but my mind had crystallized into something sharp and cold, a surgical instrument designed to cut through 34 years of scar tissue. On the passenger seat, resting on the worn upholstery, sat the manila folder that Robert Lawson had guarded with his fading life, a collection of documents that acted as the autopsy report of my stolen identity. I reached out and pulled a single sheet from the stack, a piece of yellowed stationery that carried the unmistakable, loopy handwriting of my mother, Connie Mitchell. The ink was faded, but the words were a physical blow to the solar plexus. I told everyone she died. It's easier this way. Those 8 words, penned in 1994, were the blueprint for a haunting that had lasted my entire life. As I stared at the elegant curves of her letters, the way she used to cross her T's with a flourish that looked like a bird in flight, I realized with a sickening clarity that every tear she had ever shed during my childhood was a meticulously rehearsed performance. I remembered the way she would sit on the edge of my bed on the anniversary of my supposed father's death, her eyes glistening with a moisture she called grief, telling me stories of a man who didn't exist while her real husband was out there searching every hospital and cemetery in the tri-state area. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was the director of a tragedy she had written, cast, and starred in for the benefit of a suburban audience that worshipped her resilience. I didn't cry as the realization settled into my bones, because there is no grief left for a person who turns out to be a fiction. Instead, I felt a strange, humming stillness, the kind of quiet that precedes a controlled demolition. I reached into my nursing bag, brushing past my stethoscope and a half-eaten granola bar, and pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad and a black Pilot G2 pen. I needed to see the scale of the theft, not just in emotions, but in the cold, hard numbers that my mother so dearly loved. I began to calculate the cost of 32 years of stolen birthdays, of holidays spent in a house that was a crime scene, and of a career built on the lie that I was a burden she had graciously carried. The math was cold and clinical. I wrote down the $84,200 Robert Lawson had spent on private investigators, money that should have been his retirement, money that had been bled out of a carpenter's hands because a woman wanted a silver Lexus and a colonial home. I added the $5,000 a month in trust fund payments that Julian Vane had sent for 18 years, a total of $1,080,000, of which I had seen exactly zero. My mother had siphoned that wealth like a parasite, building her real estate portfolio while I sat at her kitchen table and listened to her complain about the $40 cost of a new pair of school shoes. I calculated the interest on that stolen childhood, the psychological tax of being told I was the byproduct of an addict's mistake, and the physical toll of working 12-hour shifts at $42.50 an hour to pay off $60,000 in student loans that my mother could have covered with a single month of her hidden income. Every line I drew on that legal pad felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself from the wreckage of her deception. My mother was not a saint. She was a thief of souls, a woman who had traded the bond between a father and daughter for a curated gallery of blessed signs and a $2,400 David Yurman bracelet. The audit had begun, and I realized that the woman who whispered that I was a mistake she had to erase was about to find out that some things, once written in the blood of betrayal, can never be truly deleted. The parking lot began to fill with the morning shift cars, the sound of doors slamming and distant muffled greetings filtering through my closed windows, but I remained encased in the silence of my Honda. I looked at the letter again, the date in the corner marking the exact moment my life became a ghost story. She had walked away from a man who loved her, a man who had built her a home with his own calloused hands because he wasn't enough to satisfy the hunger of her vanity. She had taken me, a 3-year-old girl who called that man daddy, and she had buried that girl in a fictional car crash in Kentucky just so she could walk into a new life with a clean slate. The sheer technicality of her evil was breathtaking. She had navigated the legal systems of 2 states, forged signatures, and maintained a constant, high-level deception for over 3 decades without ever flinching. She had hugged me at my nursing graduation with those same hands that had signed the letters declaring me dead to the only man who truly wanted me. I thought about my apartment, the 610 square feet of thin walls and leaky faucets that I struggled to afford, and then I thought about her colonial mansion in the West Hills with its polished marble and its 6-figure car in the driveway. I thought about how she had used me as a prop in her suburban church circle, the miracle daughter who survived the tragedy of her father, gaining social capital and sympathy from people who didn't realize they were admiring a kidnapper. Every "God is good and everything happens for a reason" that had ever come out of her mouth was a mockery of the truth. She had turned my life into a commodity, a story she sold to buy her way into a higher social class. The black ink on my legal pad was blooming, the numbers growing larger and more damning with every second. I wasn't just calculating money anymore. I was calculating the weight of the 30 years of silence she had forced upon a dying man in room 12B. The audit was moving beyond the financial into the realm of total accountability. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, seeing the tired lines around my eyes and the pale, clinical blue of my scrubs. For years, I had believed that my exhaustion was a badge of honor, a sign that I was better than the man I thought had abandoned me. But now I knew that my exhaustion was just another result of her theft. I had been running a race with weights tied to my ankles while she sat in the stands and cheered for my perseverance, knowing all along that she was the one who had tied the knots. I felt a surge of cold fire in my chest, a resolve that was harder than the plastic of my cracked ID badge. Robert Lawson was going to die in a few days, maybe even hours, but he was not going to die without knowing that his search had finally ended in success. And Connie Mitchell was going to realize that her Saint of the Year ceremony was the closing act of a play that had run far too long. I started my car, the 2017 engine turning over with a familiar utilitarian hum that felt grounded and real compared to the silver Lexus my mother drove. I had the folder, I had the legal pad, and I had the piercing, lucid memory of my father's hand crushing my badge. I wasn't going to call her. I wasn't going to send a text. I was going to walk into the life she had built on my grave, and I was going to demand an accounting for every cent and every second she had stolen. The gray Ohio sky was starting to break, small slivers of pale light cutting through the clouds, reflecting off the puddles in the parking lot like shards of broken glass. I put the car in gear and began to pull out of the hospice lot, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. My mother had spent 34 years erasing me, but she had failed to realize that you can only bury the truth for so long before it starts to breathe on its own. I was the mistake she couldn't erase, the audit she couldn't avoid, and the daughter who was finally, undeniably, coming home to collect what was owed. As I drove toward the West Hills, passing the familiar landmarks of a city I thought I knew, I realized that my entire perception of the world had shifted. The stores where we had shopped, the streets where I had learned to drive, they were all part of the set dressing for Connie's long-running lie. I saw the Salon de Paris where she got her $120 highlights and felt a cold smirk touch my lips. She had spent so much money trying to look like a woman with a pure soul, but no amount of ash blonde dye could cover the darkness of what she had done in 1994. I reached into my pocket and touched the plastic lanyard, the edges sharp and broken where Robert had gripped it. It was my only souvenir from the father I had just found, a physical reminder of the cost of her survival. The silence in the car was heavy, but it wasn't lonely anymore. It was the silence of a woman who had finally found the missing pieces of her own history and was ready to fit them into place, regardless of whose world they shattered. The colonial house came into view, sitting on its manicured lawn like a fortress of respectability. I saw the silver Lexus in the driveway, its polished surface gleaming even under the overcast sky. My mother was probably inside, drinking a cup of expensive tea and planning her next charitable endeavor, unaware that the auditor was at the door. I pulled my Honda to the curb, the sound of my tires against the pavement sounding like a final warning. I gathered the folder and the legal pad, my fingers steady as I stepped out into the damp morning air. The scent of rain and wet grass was everywhere, a fresh, clean smell that seemed to strip away the lingering odor of the hospice. I walked up the stone path, each step a deliberate move toward the truth. My mother had told me it was easier to say I was dead, but she was about to find out that the living are much more expensive to maintain. The audit was officially in session, and the price of her silence was about to go up in ways she could never afford. Family isn't the story you tell the world to make yourself look like a hero. It's the truth you're brave enough to face when the lights go out. and Connie Mitchell was about to find herself in total darkness. The drive from the hospice to the downtown legal district felt like traveling through a tunnel of clarity, the familiar streets of the city blurring into a backdrop for the storm brewing in my passenger seat. I arrived at the office of Thomas Harland, a 67-year-old attorney whose practice was tucked into a pre-war building where the elevator groaned with the weight of decades. His office was a sanctuary of old-world litigation, a wood-paneled room that smelled heavily of stale espresso, expensive tobacco, and the slightly sweet, musty scent of thousands of old litigation files decomposing in their jackets. Thomas sat behind a desk made of solid, dark walnut, his spectacles perched on the end of a nose that had seen 1,000 depositions, and he looked at me not with the clinical pity I was used to at the hospice, but with the grim respect one accords to a survivor of a long-term siege. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or the empty comforts that lawyers often use to soften the blow of a difficult discovery. Instead, he reached under his desk and hauled out a heavy, gray, fireproof box, the metal scraping against the wood with a jarring, final sound. When he flipped the lid open, the air in the room seemed to change, becoming thick with the weight of 32 years of unspent love and frozen time. Inside the box were 32 wrapped birthday gifts, each one meticulously labeled in Robert Lawson's steady architectural print, representing every single year that my mother had told the world I was a corpse in a Kentucky ravine. I reached in, my fingers trembling as I touched the aged, brittle paper of a 1995 Fisher-Price medical kit. The vibrant primary colors of the wrapping paper now faded to a dull pastel by the passage of nearly 3 decades. Beneath it lay a 2002 silver locket, a 2010 set of high-end drawing pencils, and finally, a 2022 leather-bound journal with my name, Faith, embossed in gold on the cover, a gift for a 32-year-old daughter he believed was a ghost but refused to stop honoring. This box was a physical timeline of a father's devotion, a museum of the childhood that Connie had stolen from both of us to pay for her Lexus and her colonial lifestyle. Thomas Harland watched me with a quiet, observant intensity as I began to reconcile the woman I was with the daughter Robert had never stopped raising in his heart. He then slid a 3-inch thick stack of paper toward me, bound by a heavy-duty black binder clip that looked like it was struggling to contain the sheer volume of my mother's crimes. At the top of the stack was a notarized copy of the original missing persons report, case number 94-B-202, filed in Jefferson County, Kentucky, on the rainy afternoon my mother vanished with me in the middle of the night. I stared at the official seal, the cold blue ink representing the moment my life was legally fractured, and then I turned the page to find the bank statements that detailed the true cost of her survival. These weren't just numbers on a page, they were the financial records of a man's slow, deliberate sacrifice. I saw the documents showing that Robert had refinanced his modest home twice, totaling $112,000 in additional debt, just to fund the private investigators and the cross-country trips to chase down every lead that turned out to be another one of Connie's dead ends. He had lived in a state of perpetual financial ruin, working 80-hour weeks as a carpenter well into his 50s, just to keep the search alive, while my mother sat in her West Hills mansion and complained about the property taxes on a house she had bought with the silence of a billionaire. The contrast was a visceral, sickening weight in my stomach. I looked at the receipts for the $800 a day private investigators who had spent years scouring cemeteries and cold case files because my mother had told a lie so perfect that even the law believed it. This stack of paper was my arsenal, a 3-inch thick weapon forged from 30 years of suffering and stolen labor. It was a ledger of every dollar Robert had lost and every lie Connie had told, and as I gripped the heavy-duty clip, I felt the sharp edges of the paper digging into my palms like a promise of justice. Thomas Harland leaned back in his leather chair, the springs creaking in the silence of the office, and told me that Robert's final wish wasn't for revenge, but for the truth to be the last thing he heard before he closed his eyes. But as I looked at the evidence of my mother's sociopathic calculatedness, I knew that the truth alone wouldn't be enough to balance these scales. I needed an audit that would strip the silk from her back and the highlights from her hair. I thought about the way she had looked at me in the wings of that hotel ballroom, her hand gripping my arm with the strength of a woman who thought she had successfully erased her past. She had no idea that I was now standing in a wood-paneled room in the heart of the city, holding the physical proof of her kidnapping and her fraud. I looked at the Fisher-Price set again, thinking of the 4-year-old girl who should have been playing with it while her father watched from the doorway, and I felt a cold, crystalline anger replace the shock that had sustained me through the night. I was no longer just the palliative care nurse who held the hands of the dying. I was the executor of an estate of lies, and the time for a final accounting had arrived. The attorney reached into his drawer and produced one final document, a signed affidavit from the private investigator who had finally located us 2 months ago, detailing how my mother had used a series of shell companies and a false social security number to hide the trust fund payments from Julian Vane. She hadn't just stolen me from a carpenter, she had embezzled my entire future to fund her ascent into the suburban elite. The level of premeditation was staggering, a 30-year chess game where I was the most valuable piece, kept in a box until she needed me to bolster her image as a martyr. I gathered the gray fireproof box into my arms, the weight of it surprising me, as if the 32 years of gifts had physical mass that could no longer be ignored. I placed my 3-inch thick arsenal on top of it, the black clip a stark contrast against the faded wrapping paper, and I stood up with a resolve that made the air in the room feel thin and electrified. I thanked Thomas Harland, who simply nodded and told me that the law might be slow, but the truth has a way of finding its own level. As I walked out of his office, the smell of old litigation and stale espresso following me into the hallway, I felt like I was carrying the weight of 100 lives. I stepped into the elevator, the ancient machinery groaning as it descended, and I looked at my reflection in the polished brass of the doors. I saw a woman who had been told she was a mistake, a burden, and a byproduct of addiction, but the documents in my arms told a different story. I was the daughter of a man who had sacrificed everything to find me, and I was the evidence of a woman's monstrous greed. By the time the elevator hit the ground floor, I knew exactly where I was going. I wasn't going back to the hospice, and I wasn't going to my apartment with its thin walls and leaky faucets. I was going to the West Hills, to the colonial house with the 2-car garage and the silver Lexus. I was going to walk through the front door that Robert Lawson's money had indirectly helped build, and I was going to lay the 32 gifts on the marble kitchen island. I was going to show my mother the notarized reports and the bank statements that proved she was a thief of souls. I was going to let her feel the weight of the $84,000 Robert spent on investigators and the $112,000 he lost to his mortgage while she was buying $2,400 bracelets. The gray sky outside was still heavy with the threat of more rain, but as I stepped out onto the sidewalk, I didn't care about the weather. I was shielded by the truth, a 3-inch thick armor that no amount of silk or suburban respectability could pierce. My mother had spent 34 years telling me that my father was a ghost, but she was about to find out that ghosts have a way of becoming very solid when they have the receipts. I put the fireproof box in my trunk, securing it as if it were the most precious cargo on earth, and I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, breathing in the scent of my own determination. The time on my dashboard read 8:45 a.m., the hour when most of my mother's friends would be heading to their Pilates classes or meeting for coffee to discuss their latest charity auctions. They would be talking about how wonderful Connie was, how she had overcome such tragedy to raise such a hard-working daughter. They had no idea that the tragedy was a fabrication and the daughter was no longer playing her part. I shifted the car into gear, the 2017 Honda Civic feeling like a chariot of reckoning as I pulled away from the curb. The audit was no longer a calculation on a yellow legal pad. It was a physical force, a tidal wave of 30 years of suppressed reality that was about to crash against the front door of that colonial house. Family isn't the people who tell you who you are to make themselves feel better. It's the people who never stop looking for the person you actually were. And as I drove toward the West Hills, I felt the presence of the carpenter beside me, his calloused hand metaphorically on the wheel, guiding me toward the confrontation that would finally, irrevocably, set us both free. My mother had erased me to survive, but she was about to learn that you can't erase the truth without leaving a mark, and I was the mark that was finally going to stay. The setup for the Legacy of Grace luncheon at St. Matthew's was a masterclass in high society performance, a room constructed entirely out of expensive aesthetics and the hollow architecture of my mother's lies. As I stood at the threshold of the grand hall at 1:05 p.m., the air hit me with the cloying, heavy scent of over 200 floral centerpieces, specifically white hydrangeas and pale pink roses that cost $3,000 alone, mingling with the savory, buttery aroma of a $6,400 catering bill paid for by my stepfather, Gerald. The room was a sea of 21-foot ceilings and 45 perfectly circular tables draped in floor-length white Italian linens, where 212 guests sat clinking heavy silver forks against fine bone china. My mother, Connie, was the centerpiece of this curated universe, standing at a mahogany podium that looked small against the massive projector screen behind her. The screen displayed a high-definition slideshow titled A Mother's Sacrifice in an elegant gold-scripted font that seemed to mock the very air it occupied. I was wearing a navy blue tailored suit I had purchased for $600, a week's wages, and as I buttoned the jacket, the fabric felt less like wool and more like Kevlar, a tactical shield against the radiation of the deception unfolding on stage. I stepped into the room just as my mother reached the emotional crescendo of her speech, her voice catching with a practiced, melodic tremor that she had perfected over 3 decades of suburban theater. When Faith's father chose drugs over us, I had only $14 in my pocket and a 3-year-old daughter who didn't understand why her daddy wasn't coming home, she said, her hand fluttering to the delicate gold cross at her throat, while the guests let out a collective, sympathetic sigh that rippled through the hall like a breeze. She looked radiant under the warm stage lights, her $120 highlights shimmering and her $2,400 David Yurman bracelet catching the glare of the projector, a sparkling reminder of the wealth she had built on the grave of a man who was currently gasping for air in a hospice bed less than 10 miles away. I didn't take a seat at the empty chair Gerald had reserved for me at the head table. I didn't offer a polite smile to the deacons or the local business owners who nodded my way. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the AV table at the back of the room, where Mrs. Patterson, a well-meaning woman in a floral blouse, was managing the laptop and the transition of the slides. My stride was deliberate and heavy, the sound of my heels on the polished hardwood floors of St. Matthew's sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock that no one else could hear yet. Every guest I passed was a witness to the myth Connie had spent my entire life constructing, a myth of poverty and abandonment that served as the soil for her current garden of prosperity. I reached the AV table just as a grainy, black-and-white photo of a much younger Connie appeared on the screen, looking tired and bedraggled in a staged attempt to evoke the 1994 Kentucky disappearance she had engineered. Mrs. Patterson looked up at me with a startled, pleasant smile, her finger hovering over the spacebar to advance the next slide of my mother's fictional martyrdom. I didn't say a word to her. I simply reached into my navy suit jacket and pulled out a high-speed encrypted flash drive that contained the digitized contents of the 3-inch thick arsenal I had gathered from Thomas Harlan's office. I leaned over the table, my shadow falling across the laptop screen, and I whispered a single sentence to the woman whose only job was to keep the slides moving. "I have a special addition to the presentation that my mother forgot to include," I said, my voice steady and cold, a stark contrast to the emotional warmth bleeding from the speakers as Connie began to talk about the power of resilience and the grace of starting over. Mrs. Patterson, confused but trusting of the miracle daughter she had known since Sunday school, allowed me to plug the drive into the side of the silver MacBook Pro. My fingers moved with the clinical precision of a nurse prepping a surgical field, navigating through the file folders until I found the high-resolution scans of missing persons, report number 94-B-202, and the bank statements showing the $112,000 Robert Lawson had lost, trying to find the daughter Connie had declared dead. I minimized the PowerPoint presentation and queued up a new folder, one that began with the loopy, unmistakable handwriting of the 1994 letter that stated it was simply easier to tell everyone I had died. The transition took less than 10 seconds, a blink of an eye in a 34-year timeline of deception. On the stage, Connie was laughing softly now, telling a light-hearted anecdote about how she used to count pennies for bread, unaware that the pennies were actually $5,000 wire transfers from a billionaire's guilt-funded trust. She was at the peak of her social power, the saint of the year, standing before her peers in a Diane von Furstenberg dress that cost more than my first car, basking in the light of a fire she had started and then claimed to have survived. I felt the weight of the 32 birthday gifts sitting in the fireproof box in my car, and I thought of Robert's calloused carpenter's hand crushing my plastic badge in room 12B. The injustice of the scene before me, the $6,400 lunch, the white linens, the performative grief, was a physical pressure in the room, a density that made it hard to breathe. I signaled to Mrs. Patterson to hit the enter key, and then I stepped away from the table, turning to face the podium as the projector screen flickered and then changed. The image of a young, struggling Connie disappeared, replaced by the stark, official header of the Kentucky State Police Missing Persons Department. The room went silent in a way I have only ever experienced in the moments after a patient's heart stops, a profound and sudden vacuum of sound where the only thing left is the reality of what has been lost. My mother didn't see the screen at first. She was too busy looking at Gerald, who was beaming with pride from the front row, his hand resting on the silver Lexus key fob on the table. But the silence eventually reached her, a cold wave that caused her to falter in the middle of a sentence about the importance of community support. She turned her head, her ash-blonde highlights catching the light one last time, and her eyes locked onto the screen. She saw the report, she saw the date of 1994, and then, as I clicked the remote I had taken from Mrs. Patterson's hand, she saw the bank statements. The room remained paralyzed as the evidence began to scroll. The refinanced mortgages, the $84,000 in private investigator fees, and finally, the photo of Robert Lawson, skeletal and dying, holding a sign that read, "Faith is not dead." The gasp that went through the 212 guests was not one of sympathy this time. It was the sound of 1,000 glass houses shattering at once. I walked toward the center aisle, my navy suit a dark streak against the white linens, and I stopped exactly halfway between the door and the woman who had kidnapped me and called it a sacrifice. Every head in the room turned toward me, the miracle daughter who was supposed to be the proof of Connie's virtue. I didn't look at them. I looked at her, watching as the color drained from her face, leaving her looking as pale and brittle as the man she had erased. The David Yurman bracelet on her wrist seemed to grow heavy, pulling her arm down as she gripped the edges of the podium to keep from collapsing. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin one more lie, to offer one more curated explanation. But the screen behind her was now showing the 1994 letter in her own handwriting. "It's easier this way," the giant, loopy letters screamed to the entire congregation of St. Matthew's. The audit had moved from the parking lot to the public square, and the cost of her 32 years of stolen birthdays was finally being billed to the only person who could pay it. Gerald, my stepfather, was staring at the screen with a look of dawning horror, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the wine in his glass as he realized his silver Lexus and his colonial home had been the rewards for a crime he hadn't known he was participating in. I stood my ground, my feet planted firmly on the hardwood, feeling the presence of the 3-year-old girl I used to be standing right beside me. We were no longer mistakes to be erased. We were the truth that could no longer be contained by silk dresses or $6,000 catering bills. The air in the hall was no longer scented with hydrangeas. It smelled of the metallic tang of an ending, the ozone before a strike of lightning. My mother's mouth worked silently, her Saint of the Year award sitting on the table beside the podium like a mocking piece of junk. She had traded a man's life and a daughter's history for a room full of people who were now looking at her with the same revulsion I had felt in the attic of the Cannon Beach house. The legacy of Grace was over, and in its place was the cold, hard reality of the Lawson audit. I didn't need to say a word to the crowd. The 3-inch thick stack of paper on the screen was doing all the talking for me. I watched the woman I had called Mom for 34 years realize that the curtain had finally fallen. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who felt small. I was the one who was whole, while she was the one who was finally, undeniably, a ghost. The projector continued to cycle through the evidence, showing the receipts for the Fisher-Price set and the 2022 leather journal, the physical timeline of a father's love that she had tried to burn. The silence in the room was so thick, it felt like a physical weight, a pressure that was forcing the truth out of the shadows and into the harsh light of the mid-afternoon sun. My mother's eyes met mine across the expanse of the 45 round tables, and in that moment, the mask finally slipped. There was no grace left in her expression, only the raw, jagged edges of a cornered predator who knew the hunt was over. She had spent 34 years building a fortress out of lies, but she had forgotten that a fortress is also a cage. As I turned to walk out of the hall, the sound of my navy suit rustling against the silence, I knew that I was leaving behind the girl she had tried to kill in 1994. I was walking toward the man in room 12B, carrying the only thing he had ever truly wanted, the knowledge that his sacrifice had worked. Family isn't the person who stands at a podium and tells everyone how much they've given up. It's the person who stands in the back of the room and makes sure the truth is finally told. And as the doors of St. Matthew's closed behind me, I felt the first breath of a life that was finally, completely mine. The audit was finished, the debt was settled, and Connie Mitchell was left alone with the $14 she had always claimed was all she had. The atmosphere in the grand hall of St. Matthew's fractured instantly as I stepped into the light of the stage, my presence a jarring contrast to the sea of pastel dresses and expensive tailored blazers that filled the 45 round tables. I reached out and took the $300 Shure microphone from the stand, the cold metal feeling heavy and significant in my palm, and the feedback hummed for a split second before my voice projected across the 212 guests with a clarity that cut through the polite murmurs like a surgical blade. "Actually, Mom, let's look at the real sacrifice sequence," I said, and the amplified sound of my voice seemed to vibrate the very crystals in the chandeliers hanging from the 21-foot ceilings. I didn't wait for her permission or for the stunned silence of the crowd to settle. I simply reached over to the AV table and swapped the USB drive with a hand that didn't tremble, despite the adrenaline roaring through my veins like a freight train. The projector screen, which had been displaying a curated image of my mother smiling in front of our colonial home, suddenly flashed and transformed into something far more visceral and honest than anything this room had ever seen. It wasn't my graduation photos or the staged images of our supposed struggle that filled the massive screen, but rather the stark, high-resolution scans of Robert Lawson's private investigator receipts and the haunting, loopy script of the 1994 letter that had acted as my death warrant. The room went silent enough to hear the physical impact of a single silver fork hitting a fine bone china plate at table 4. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had donated $10,000 to my mother's charity, sat frozen with her hand over her mouth. I began to read the police report numbers aloud, my voice steady and clinical as I recited case number 94-B-202, the cold digits echoing against the mahogany paneling of the hall like a funeral toll. My mother's face, which had been glowing with the triumph of her Saint of the Year award only moments before, turned the color of cold ash, the carefully applied makeup suddenly looking like a cracked mask over a crumbling foundation. She gripped the edges of the podium so hard that her knuckles turned white, her $2,400 David Yurman bracelet clinking against the wood in a frantic, uneven rhythm that betrayed her terror. I didn't stop at the digital display. I reached into the heavy leather briefcase I had brought from the hospice and began to hand out 50 photocopied packets of her confession letter and the bank statements to the prominent guests in the front 3 rows. The paper was crisp and cold, the black ink of her own handwriting from 30 years ago staring back at the city's elite, documenting her decision that it was simply easier to tell the world I had died than to stay with a man who wasn't wealthy enough for her ambitions. I watched as the governor's wife took a packet, her eyes widening as she scanned the words. It's easier this way, and I felt a profound, jagged sense of relief that the weight of this secret was finally being distributed among the people who had funded her lies. My father is dying in room 12B at Riverside Hospice right now, I told the crowd, my voice dropping an octave but gaining a density that seemed to anchor everyone to their seats. He never touched a needle, and he never traded a crib for a fix. He only touched the custom furniture he built and then sold to pay for the search for the daughter you stole from him. The silence in the hall was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum, a space where the 32 years of my mother's carefully managed narrative were being sucked into the void of the truth. I looked at the $6,400 catering spread, the salmon en croûte, and the organic microgreens, and I thought of the $84,200 that had been bled out of my father's life to find a ghost. I looked at my mother, who was now swaying slightly as if the very air in the room had become too thin for her to breathe, and I saw the predator realize that the hunt had finally turned inward. She had spent 3 decades painting a portrait of a monster to hide the one she saw in the mirror every morning. And now, in front of the 212 people whose respect she valued more than her child's soul, the paint was being stripped away to reveal the raw, ugly wood beneath. I stood there in my navy suit, feeling the ghost of the carpenter's hand on my shoulder. And I realized that I wasn't just a palliative care nurse anymore. I was the auditor of a spiritual debt that had finally come due in full. Every person at those white-linened tables was now forced to confront the reality that their saint of the year was a kidnapper who had used their charity to buy her own redemption. I watched as Gerald, my stepfather, reached out to touch the packet I had handed him, his fingers shaking as he recognized the handwriting of the woman he thought he knew. The slideshow on the screen continued to scroll through the evidence, the refinanced mortgage documents from 1998, the private investigator reports from 2005, and the photo of the wooden birds Robert had carved for a nursery that remained empty for 30 years. The contrast between the skeletal, dying man on the screen and the woman in the silk Diane von Furstenberg dress was a moral chasm that no amount of church-sanctioned grace could bridge. I took a deep breath, the scent of the $3,000 worth of hydrangeas now smelling like the cloying sweetness of a funeral home, and I felt a sense of finality settle into my bones that was more powerful than any morphine drip I had ever administered. My mother tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out except for a small, broken whimper that was lost in the vastness of the hall. She looked at the crowd, searching for a single face that would offer her a lifeline of denial, but she found only the cold, hard stares of people who realized they had been the audience for a 3-decade-long fraud. I didn't feel pity for her, and I didn't feel the need to offer the comfort I gave to the strangers in the hospice. I only felt the requirement to finish the accounting. I leaned back into the microphone, the Shure catching the sound of my heartbeat for a second, and I looked directly at the woman who had erased me to survive. You told me I was a mistake you had to erase, but the only mistake was believing that a man's love could be bought off with $5,000 wire transfers and a fake car crash, I said, the words hitting the back wall of the hall and bouncing back like a physical force. I looked down at the 50 packets circulating through the room, the sound of pages turning being the only noise left in the St. Matthew's ballroom. I thought of the $12 plastic lanyard in my pocket, the one that Robert had crushed with his dying strength, and I felt a surge of cold, crystalline pride that I was his daughter, and not hers. She had raised me to be a prop, a miracle daughter to validate her martyrdom, but she had accidentally raised a woman who knew exactly how to identify a terminal lie. The legacy of Grace Luncheon had become a tribunal of truth, and as I stepped down from the stage, leaving the microphone on the podium for her to face the silence, I felt the air around me finally clear of the industrial bleach and the expensive perfume. I walked down the center aisle, past the 45 tables of stunned socialites and silent businessmen, and I didn't look back to see if she was still standing. The weight of the 3-inch thick arsenal was gone, replaced by the lighter, more permanent weight of a daughter who finally knew her own name. I pushed through the heavy oak doors of the church, the cool, damp Ohio air hitting my face with a freshness that made my lungs ache with the sheer reality of it. I had the fireproof box in my car, I had the leather journal for my father, and I had the absolute certainty that the audit was complete. Connie Mitchell would have to figure out how to live in a world where her highlights and her Lexus couldn't hide the missing persons report number 94-B-202. As I started my 2017 Honda Civic, the engine sounding like a grounded, honest machine compared to the theater I had just left, I looked at the dashboard clock. 1:45 p.m. I had just enough time to get back to Riverside Hospice, to room 12B, and to sit with the man who had spent $84,000 just to hear me breathe one more time. Family isn't the people who share a stage with you under false pretenses. It's the person who stays in the shadows and never stops fighting to find you. And as I drove away from St. Matthews, I knew that the daughter Robert Lawson had lost in 1994 was finally, truly, coming home. The gray sky was beginning to break apart, letting in shards of pale, watery sunlight that reflected off the puddles in the parking lot. I felt a strange sense of peace, the kind that only comes after a storm has leveled everything that wasn't built on solid ground. My mother's colonial house, her silver car, her David Yurman bracelet, they were all just debris now, scattered by the force of 30 years of suppressed truth. I was no longer the nurse watching the clock hit 3:14 a.m. with a sense of existential debt. I was a woman who had seen the receipts of her own worth and found them to be immeasurable. I drove toward the hospice, my eyes fixed on the horizon, ready to offer the only palliative care that mattered. The truth that we were both found, and that the mistake had finally been corrected. The audit of the Lawson family was over, the books were closed, and for the first time in 34 years, the balance was exactly where it needed to be. I was Faith Lawson, daughter of a carpenter, and I was done being anyone's sacrifice. The fallout from that afternoon at St. Matthew's was not a slow burn, but a surgical demolition of the life Connie Mitchell had spent 3 decades constructing with the precision of a master thief. Within 72 hours of the luncheon, the colonial house in the West Hills was no longer a sanctuary of suburban peace, as my stepfather, Gerald, filed for divorce and cited gross fraud in the execution of their original 1998 prenuptial agreement. He had discovered that the woman he married was not the tragic, penniless widow he had pledged to protect, but a woman who had entered their union with a stolen child and a hidden trust fund that made his own dealership earnings look like pocket change. The legal documents he filed were as cold as the marble counters in her kitchen, stripping away her access to the joint accounts and the silver Lexus that had once been the crown jewel of her social standing. Simultaneously, the board at St. Matthew's acted with a swiftness that bordered on desperation to distance themselves from the scandal, officially stripping my mother of her Legacy of Grace title and requesting that she vacate all volunteer positions and board seats by the end of the week. The Saint of the Year had become a pariah in the very circles where she once reigned, her name whispered now not with reverence, but with the sharp, biting edge of betrayal. While my mother's world was collapsing into a heap of litigation and social exile, I retreated to the only place that felt grounded in reality, room 12B at Riverside Hospice. I spent the final 14 days of Robert Lawson's life sitting by his bedside, the sterile air of the unit replaced in my mind by the profound weight of the time we had lost. I didn't care about the $60,000 student loans or the $1,400 rent that had once defined my stress. I only cared about the rhythmic, shallow breathing of the man who had spent $84,000 just to find out if I was still breathing. In the quiet hours of those final 2 weeks, when the rest of the world was debating the scandal at the church, Robert and I lived in a cocoon of reclaimed history. He had brought a small, battery-operated cassette player to the hospital, and together we listened to a 1992 Maxell tape that had captured the sound of my first words. The audio was grainy, filled with the static of 3 decades, but I could hear the high-pitched, bubbly voice of a 3-year-old girl saying, "Daddy," over and over again as the sound of a hammer hitting a nail rang out in the background. It was the most expensive sound I had ever heard, a piece of my soul that Connie had tried to incinerate, now playing on a loop in a room that smelled of hand sanitizer and impending peace. Robert couldn't speak much toward the end, his body having surrendered nearly everything to the cancer. But his eyes never left my face, and his hand never let go of mine. He died at 4:12 a.m. on a Friday, holding the very hand he had searched for through 11,680 days of silence, grief, and unyielding hope. In those final moments, there was no morphine-induced confusion, only a deep, settled clarity that the ledger was finally balanced. He didn't leave behind a colonial mansion or a silver Lexus, but he left me something far more substantial. A small, weathered 2-bedroom cottage in Wheeling, West Virginia, the same house where he had hand-carved the wooden birds for my nursery. The property was modest, valued at perhaps $110,000, but to me, it was a palace built of truth and mahogany, a place where the walls didn't hide secrets behind blessed signs. Inheriting that cottage felt like receiving a deed to my own identity, a physical space where I could finally exist without the shadow of my mother's narrative looming over me. I moved my few belongings out of the 610-square-foot apartment in Portland and drove the silver Honda Civic across the state lines, leaving behind the hospice shifts and the $42.50 an hour that had felt like a life sentence. As I stood in the small living room in Wheeling, looking at the built-in bookshelves Robert had crafted with such care, I realized that I had inherited a peace that money simply cannot buy. It was a quietness in my spirit, a resolution of the dissonance that had hummed in my blood for 34 years. I was no longer the miracle daughter or the byproduct of an addict's mistake. I was Faith Lawson, the daughter of a man who loved me enough to bankrupt himself for the mere possibility of my existence. The cost of my truth had been astronomical, measured in Robert's lost decades and my own stolen childhood, but the audit was finally, irrevocably closed. My mother, Connie, ended up in a small rented condominium on the outskirts of the city, her silver Lexus replaced by a sensible used sedan, and her David Yurman bracelet likely sitting in a pawn shop to cover her mounting legal fees. I didn't reach out to her, and she didn't reach out to me. The silence between us was the only honest thing we had ever shared. She had spent her life trying to erase a mistake that wasn't a mistake at all, but a beautiful, inconvenient reality that she couldn't control. I found the 2022 leather journal Robert had bought for me, and on the first page, I began to write my own story. Not the one scripted in silk and highlights, but the one written in sawdust and the sound of a 1992 cassette tape. I spent my evenings on the porch of the Wheeling cottage, watching the sunset over the Ohio River, feeling the cool evening air on my skin, and knowing that every breath I took was a breath that Robert had fought to witness. The weight of the 3-inch thick arsenal was gone, replaced by the solid foundation of a history that was finally mine to keep. I thought about the many patients I had seen pass away at the hospice and how they all sought a moment of absolute honesty before the end. Robert had achieved that, and in doing so, he had given me the permission to live the rest of my life in the light. I realized then that family isn't the people who provide you with a 2-car garage or a prestigious name. Family is the person who refuses to believe you are dead when the rest of the world has already moved on. It is the person who refinances their home and works until their hands are raw just to find the girl with the crescent-shaped scar on her temple. I am a nurse, a daughter, and a survivor of a 30-year fraud. but mostly I am a woman who finally knows the value of her own soul. The audit of Connie Mitchell and Robert Lawson had been a brutal, life-altering process, but as I looked at the hand-carved wooden birds hanging in the window of my new home, I knew that the truth was worth every cent and every second it took to find. The cottage in Wheeling was filled with the scent of old wood and the lingering spirit of a man who never gave up, a far cry from the industrial bleach and expensive perfume that had defined my previous life. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs without the tightness of suppressed resentment or the fear of a hidden past. I was 34 years old, and for the first time, I wasn't running from anything. I was simply home. I walked into the kitchen, the same kitchen where my father had likely sat and planned his next search for me, and I poured a cup of coffee into a simple ceramic mug. I looked out at the garden, which was overgrown and in need of the same care Robert had given to his furniture, and I felt a surge of energy to begin the work of my own life. There would be no more Saint of the Year ceremonies, no more $6,000 luncheons, and no more lies about $14 in a pocket. There was only the truth, the quiet, humming reality of a life reclaimed from the wreckage of a masterpiece of deception. As the moon rose over the West Virginia hills, I sat in the darkness of the porch and let the silence wash over me. It was a silence that was full, not empty, a silence that carried the echoes of a 1992 tape and the memory of a calloused hand. My mother had said she erased me to survive, but in the end her survival was a hollow shell, while my existence was a vibrant, undeniable fact. I had exposed the lie. I had dismantled the museum of her vanity, and in the ruins I had found the father I was always meant to have. The peace I felt was a heavy, comforting blanket, a reward for the courage it took to walk onto that stage and demand an accounting. I was Faith Lawson, and I was finally, beautifully, undeniably real. The story was no longer a tragedy. It was a testament to the fact that love, when it is forged in truth and tempered by sacrifice, is the only thing that actually survives the audit of time. I looked at the stars, thinking of the 11,680 days that Robert had waited for me, and I made a vow to make every day of my own life count for the both of us. The medical-grade hand sanitizer and the silk-wrap dresses were a lifetime away, relics of a woman I no longer had to be. I was the daughter of a carpenter, and I had the tools now to build whatever life I wanted on a foundation that would never crumble. The audit was finished. The debt was paid. And as I closed my eyes in the house my father built, I knew that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Family isn't a name on a birth certificate. It's the person who stays when the truth comes out and the person who goes looking for you when everyone else says you're gone. I was found, and that was more than enough.